Deborah's new book, she's a prolific writer, a very important scholar on these issues. She's been writing books and articles for decades. She has a new book that just came out recently, and it's called Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and I highly recommend it. And you know, her resume is long, but I don't want to take time from her. But it's really, you know, Deborah, it's a great honor for the ISGAP team and for the people here that you have taken the time out of your schedule to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles. And I have to say, I stand in awe of what you have built. It's really terrific. I had prepared a speech this morning, a talk this morning on my general perspectives on anti-Semitism. And then after listening to the program and sitting through a couple of lectures, yesterday I threw it away. I didn't throw it away. I filed it under for use later. And I decided that I wanted to dig more deeply into the issue of Holocaust denial as a form of anti-Semitism. So that's what I'm going to do. Hopefully we'll have time for questions. And then there's, I think, a discussion group after this, and if you have general questions on issues of anti-Semitism that somehow miraculously and unbelievably have not yet been covered or are not on the program to be covered in the next week, that you'll ask me about them. Now what I want to do is propose a structure for Holocaust denial, and I call it a three-legged stool. First of all, illogic and would be one leg, willful distortions would be a second leg, and camouflaged discourse would be the third leg. And if you're imagining a little footstool, the seat of the stool, the seat from which it all emanates, is classic anti-Semitism. So I'll come to that at the end. I have to say that when I first heard about Holocaust denial, some of you may have seen my TED Talk, which I gave on this topic, but the first thing I did was I laughed. Who would take these guys seriously? They have no evidence, they have no narrative, they have no witnesses. Who would take them seriously? They seemed to me akin to flat earth theorists or people who are convinced Elvis Presley is alive and well. And I had heard this, and then when I began to work on it, and I was brought to work on it not out of a deep and abiding interest in Holocaust denial. I really also thought it was, for those of you who know Yiddish, Narishkeit, garbage, silly, stupid, whatever. Because two prominent historians of the Holocaust, Yehuda Bauer and Yisrael Gutman, names that might be well known to you if you've done any research or history of the Holocaust, came to me and said, Deborah, we'd like you to study this. And they were coming to me within the context of the Hebrew University's Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And I looked at them and I said, you take these guys seriously? And they say, yes, we do, and we think it's important. So if two people of this stature come to you and say, we think something is important, you don't just laugh it off, but I have to say, I still had my doubts. And one of the reasons even with these doubts, that I nonetheless did it, because Holocaust deniers' arguments just seemed too absurd to be taken seriously, was my assumption that this would be a momentary matter. I would do, I had just finished one book, I hadn't yet turned to another topic, someone hands you a topic, a little bit of a rant, never hurts, especially when you're at the beginning of your career. And I said, okay, so I'll spend 2-3 years working on this, I'll learn something, and then on to other things. So I was wrong on a number of accounts. First of all, as you well know, and you know from Charles's introduction, this would be far more than a momentary plunge. It would constitute the better part of my academic career and involve me in a 6-7 year long legal battle. And secondly, denial was worth taking seriously. Not panicking about, not thinking that, everyone's going to become a denier. The fact is that there are far more people who never heard of the Holocaust than who deny its existence. So, just get this out of the way before I trip on it. But still, it is something to be taken seriously. And finally, it is, as I've said before, and I'll repeat again, a classic form of anti-Semitism. So what do I mean by a three-legged stool? A lack of logic. The arguments are illogical. They are the same kind of illogic, and you heard this yesterday from Professor Patterson and other people, I'm sure, that are endemic to a conspiracy theory. It's exactly what you'd expect from a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories by nature are illogical. There is willful distortion and invention of evidence. And when I say willful distortion, it also means ignoring evidence that is all conclusive. So either you distort what exists, you ignore it, or you invent. Also things endemic to conspiracy theories. Those of you who heard the talk yesterday, mentioned the talk yesterday in discussion of the protocols, both in the yesterday afternoon's talk and in the show we heard last night. And again, to go back to my point earlier, but to reiterate, there's a modus operandi that conveniently disguises extremism, disguises prejudice and racism in the form of rational discourse. And when I first began to write on this and to think about it, Holocaust Denial was one of my few examples, though you also saw it in terms, certainly in the United States, of racism. Arguments made by seeming scholars who would say that the black person is genetically inferior, or would be making overtly racist arguments, posing overtly racist arguments, but not sitting there in a Ku Klux Klan robe or a hood, but sitting there in a academic garb and sounding and publishing books with lots of footnotes, sounding like they were making a rational argument. So what do I mean? Let's start with the first leg, denial of logic. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. The Armenian genocide is fairly well documented. Of course, we don't have all the documents from the Armenian genocide because the Turkish government prevents that from happening and prevents them from being released. But certainly the Holocaust has this distinction of 20th century genocide and being conducted by a state with a state apparatus. The documentation is immense. So what do deniers say? Deniers, of course, will say, well, those documents were planted, were forged by Jews with the collusion of the Allies and the Soviets after the war. Now, of course, they were found immediately after the war, so the collusion must have been going on, from the denier's perspective, all through the war. But forging a document is not simple. I mean, in other words, you can't forge a pile of documents and then say, okay, as soon as the war is over, we're going to go and plant all these documents. Because, first of all, if you've ever worked in German World War II, or even not World War II era archives, or diplomatic archives of any kind, but certainly the German World War II era documents, they have a very complex filing system and classification system. So you can't suddenly stick something in the middle where it doesn't belong, where it doesn't follow in sequence. More importantly, you can't stick it in there on a typewriter, which is what would have been used, whose font doesn't match the documents that came before and the documents that came after. Now, you could say someone changed typewriters, but if all these documents are suddenly, of a different font, that calls into question. The other thing, of course, that would have to be, and when I say this to my students, I have to explain it to them because they don't know what it is, and some of you in this audience may be young enough also not to know what it is, but the typewriter ribbon had to be of the same strength, the arguments of the documents type before or type after. When they look at typewriter ribbon, what is that? I say printer cartridge. Oh, then they get it. So, in other words, you can't just stick something in the middle. Copies of the original document that were sent to someone must be replicated by copies in the sender's files. You can't just, again, if you're planting military government documents, you can't just plant them around or say, oh, look, I found this here, independent of anything else. The paper used must be of the wartime era. So all these things on a technological basis, forensic basis, immediately raise questions about, oh, this is a forged document. By the way, the same thing can be said of wartime diaries. Now, one of the things that deniers are most prone to go after and try to prove as a forgery is Anne Frank's diary. You might think, why do they spend all this effort on Anne Frank's diary? They spend all this effort on Anne Frank's diary because for many young people, it is their first introduction to the Holocaust. So if we can pull out the foundation stone, which made you think that the Holocaust is real, then they hope they can collapse everything else. So what will they argue? They'll argue, oh, Anne Frank's diary was written in green ballpoint pen. And, you know, a green ballpoint pen didn't exist till after the war, didn't come into use till after the war. There are one or two, I'm not sure, I don't remember, it's 1, 2, or 3 notations in the margin. There are a few, so let's just say a few notations in the margin by editors who never dreamt that they would be writing on the original manuscript of something that would become so exceptionally valuable. But they made notations about editing, about publication, etc. But I've seen the diary itself. It's not, I can assure you, it's not in green ballpoint pen. And better than me, the Dutch wartime, the archives to which this diary has been given by the Frank family, by Otto Frank, was so distressed by the attacks on the diary that I believe was in the early 90s. They published this massive book, some of you may have seen it, Anne Frank, the Critical Edition. It has, first of all, her original version of the diary, rewritten version of the diary, because she rewrites it for publication. And by the way, parenthetically, Philip Roth, the late Philip Roth, in looking at those two forms, said she would have been a great writer because at age 15, she knew how to edit herself. In any case, and it has the fictional thing so it's set up, you can see how each one is a little different, but there are also essays, and essays by forensic specialists who studied the ink, who studied the glue of the diary, who studied the paper, and who also studied, we have lots of examples of Anna's handwriting, because in her school before, with her friends, she signed what we used to call autograph books. She sent postcards to friends, not of course from the annex, but before. So the forensic specialist can look at a handwriting and say, this is how a handwriting will change from when someone is 11, someone is 13, someone is 15 or 16, and all those things match. But it's not only the quality of the documents that throws question or throws the denier's claims into doubt. It makes it illogical. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Certainly survivors. Now, some deniers will say, well, this survivor says, you know, I got off the train and I walked 10 feet to where Mengele was standing, and this survivor says, I got off the train and we had to walk a half a mile to where Mengele was standing. Well, if you're talking, let's say, about the Hungarian deportations, when the trains were already coming into Birkenau, and I assume that some of you have visited Birkenau, for the Hungarian deportations, you know, the iconic picture, the iconic gate with the train going through, that's when that train spur was added to facilitate the quick destruction of Hungarian Jewry. There were a lot of Jews to be killed in a relatively short time, so they pulled the train in there. That train ran the length, again, if you've been to Birkenau, you've seen pictures, you know the train runs the length of the camp. So some survivors say, I was reported from Budapest on this particular day, we got off the train and we turned to, and we arrived at this place, we were pulled off the cars and we had to line up and walk to our right, where the doctors were standing. Everyone says Mengele, it's not always Mengele, there were other doctors as well, but he has sort of become euphemistic or iconic for all the doctors. And some people say we got off the train and we walked to our left. Well, it depended, the doctors stood in the middle. So if you got on the train at the end or you got on the train in the beginning, it depends what direction you went to. So there are all kinds of discrepancies which can be explained logically, but Were every denier to give you the, because a survivor, but because the deniers hone in on every little, oh, she said that, and she said this, she said there were 20 people in the room, and she said there were 40 people in the car, 20 in the car, 40 in the car. Were every person to give you the exact same description with no discrepancies, that should raise suspicions. If, God forbid, suddenly there was a fire alarm, false alarm, but let's say, and we had to run out of here quickly. And it turns out that some sociology class is doing a little experiment. And when they get us outside, they separate each one of us and they say, how many people were in the room? How many rows were in the room? What color were the chairs? Well, that's easy to remember. But, you know, how many tiers up were there? All sorts of things, which if you're sitting and looking around, someone's asking you, you look around and you see. But if there's a trauma, you suddenly have to race out. You're not going to, if everybody said, oh, there were 12 rows and there were 82 people in the room and the first row had 15 seats and the last row, as it got narrower, the last row had X number of seats, then you get suspicious. Especially if you're talking about a traumatic moment. And I can think of no more traumatic moment than people being unloaded from a boxcar after having, or a train after having traveled without water, without facilities into an unknown area. And of course, the arrivals were at night. By and large, all arrivals were at night. And they were conducted yelling, screaming, get off, get off, get off, get off, you know, line up, pushing people, because it dislocated people. We assumed that that was the reason. It dislocated people and it made you more pliable when you don't know exactly what's going on. So certainly, if everyone had the exact information, what day we arrived, what time we arrived, how long it took, I would be more skeptical than with discordant notes. Now, you may think it's absurd for anyone to think that people would have this exact information, but in the Auschwitz-Birkenau trial, or the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trials, which took place after the Eichmann trial, sort of the Eichmann trial, they had been in preparation, but they sort of embarrassed Germany to get them organized and conducted a little faster. Defense attorneys asked survivors, what time did this happen? What day did this happen? Now, survivors had neither calendars, inmates in the camps had neither calendars nor wristwatches. But if they couldn't answer that, time, date, precise location, they were attacked by the defense attorneys as not being worthy witnesses. So it's not such an absurd thing when, you know, that kind of thing will be used against the survivor, not just by deniers, but by these defense attorneys. But who else would have to be wrong other than survivors? Bystanders. The people who lived, whether it's the town of Auschwitz, or the village of Treblinka, or in Lublin, or in many, many other places, talking about the death camps or talking about the shooting spaces, Einsatzgruppen, people who live near the places or on the road where, or just in the towns and in the villages where Jews were marched out into ditches that had been dug and were shot. And those people have many of them have acknowledged, yes, we saw this. In Shoah, Lanzmann has interviews with the people from the town of Treblinka and saying we knew what was going on there. That's not to say there was anything they could have done about it. You can make a brief against what some Polish people did and did not do. But on that grounds, I don't think there's much that can be argued. Just a parenthetical observation. But they saw the trains going in day after day filled with people coming out empty. Father Patrick Deborah has gotten a lot of, a French Catholic priest, has gotten testimony from many of the people in Belarus and in other parts of Eastern Europe about saying, oh, there's a grave, there's a site over there of a grave of 200 bodies. There's a site of grave over there. They were kids then. One of the reasons they often give this information is to Father Deborah. He comes with his collar, and the local priest says, you can talk to him. He's a man of God. So, and people want to sort of confess that they know this prior to their demise. But it's not just survivors and bystanders. Historians, scholars, thousands of scholars in Israel, in North and South America, in Australia, in Asia, in every part of the world who have worked on different aspects of this, would all have to have been duped or in on the hoax and not talked about it. So again, that beggars the imagination in terms of, wait a minute, that just doesn't make sense. That you would get these thousands of people to take part in, to write articles, to do research, to find documents, and they're all on the hoax, and they've all either been duped, tricked, or they're in on it and haven't spoken about it. But finally, the most important way of answering deniers' claims is the perpetrators. The perpetrators. In not one war crimes trial after World War II did a perpetrator say it didn't happen. They said, I didn't do it. I was just following orders. I had no choice. But not, it didn't happen. And that is, of course, quite striking. And we even have written evidence. This was released by the Israeli government for my trial. In the lull or the gap between the end of testimony and the decision of the High Court in Israel about Eichmann's fate, he wrote a memoir while he was in prison. And after he died, the Israeli government had it, and they decided to just bury it in the archives because, according to what I was told, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion said this man had months on the stand to make his, give his lies and to lie about what he did. We're not responsible for publishing it, etc. But over the years, in the 90s, the children of the Eichmann family tried to get the diary. Maybe they thought they could sell it, whatever it was. And there was a big debate in Israel about what should be done. Should they release it? Should they release it in an annotated fashion? There was all sorts of discussions, and the government brought together leading historians to talk about this. And in what has become endemic to the Middle East, in all its aspects, nothing happened. So the diary sat there. But during my trial, one of my students, in fact, said, why don't you try to get the diary? And though we didn't really need it as evidence, I thought, oh, this would be a good way of trying to get it released, and the Israeli government did agree to release it, and they released it. And in that diary, or in that memoir, that period that he writes from, I think it's about August till about December, maybe it's a little earlier than August, he repeatedly makes reference to gassings. And on top of that, remember, Eichmann is this, I would say, not the CEO, but the management, one of the chief managers, COO, not the chief. It wasn't the Holocaust was not his idea, his invention, but he's one of the chief operating officers. Certainly, as it comes to Western Europe, certainly it comes to Greek Jewry, and certainly as it comes to Hungarian Jewry. And when he was in Argentina, when he was enabled to escape to Argentina, while he was there were a group of German expats, many of them faithful Nazis. He gave talks to them. And in the talks, we had they were taped because the man who arranged it thought, well, maybe he could eventually sell these as a book, make some money with Eichmann, etc. In those tapes, there were repeated references to the mass murder of the Jews, to gas, etc. The expats sitting there said, oh, no, this can't be true. They were out of Germany. They were loyal Nazis. They created Nazi schools, et cetera, in Argentina. But when they heard Eichmann tell it, they said, oh, he must be making this up. And people said, he's making it up, But on some level, there is birth some of denial. There's a very good book on this by Bettina Stangneth called Eichmann Before Jerusalem, Eichmann for Jerusalem. So you have so you have survivors, bystanders, historians, perpetrators. That's pretty darn, and you have all these documents. what are some of the other illogical inconsistencies inherent in deniers' arguments? Well, one is, why has Germany shouldered the enormous, not just financial, but moral burden for this crime if it didn't happen? It's a burden that it carries to this day. I mean, when Angela Merkel made her decision about allowing in refugees, whatever you think of that decision, the 1 million refugees, she referenced the Holocaust. So it's something that will, we hope, I'm not saying in terms of guilt, but certainly in terms of national responsibility, because, you know, as William Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. I mean, it's in their history. But why would the Germans take responsibility for this enormous genocide? Now, deniers have a simple explanation. Again, rooted in anti-Semitism. The Jews presented the Germans with an ultimatum. Either you admit to this crime, or we will never allow you back in the family of nations. But they weren't asking them to admit to some small crime. You looted this place, you looted that place. They were asking them to admit to the worst, the most all-encompassing genocide. There had been other genocides, and despite the mantra never again, there have been other genocides since then, but none of this magnitude in terms of geographic area, in terms of a state government going outside its boundaries, going to Rhodes, going to Corfu, going, you know, et cetera, people of all ages and abilities, you know that. So the notion that the Germans would admit to a genocide of these unprecedented proportions and would impose on their nation and subsequent generations, here we are over 7 decades since the end, a horrific legacy that would become part of its national identity, beggars the imagination. You know, it's like saying to someone, unless you admit to this crime, you're going to get a terrible jail sentence. But if you admit to this crime, you're going to get a terrible jail sentence. You know, so in other words, you're not going to be allowed back into the family of nations if you don't admit to this crime. Well, if you admit to this crime, you may be allowed back in, but with a terrible and a weighty legacy. Now, another illogical argument made by the Germans, by the deniers, especially David Irving, he built much of his career on this argument. Show me the written order authorizing the murder of all European Jews. Show me that one document. I, Adolf Hitler, hereby ordered the murder of European Jews. And then I'll believe it. Now, there are many ways of discounting this argument. First of all, Hitler realized the folly of writing such an order. He had written such an order for the program, those unworthy of life, you know, the murder of handicapped people with disabilities, or anyone they termed as having disabilities, etc. And he wasn't going to put his hand to something like this. Moreover, that wasn't really his style of writing an order. It was giving the suggestion, and then the underlings, all those around him, did what was called working towards the Fuhrer. Get rid of the Jews. And we have notations from Himmler's diary and other things of his pushing for this, absolutely. But historians never rest their conclusion, certainly about something this vast, on one document. In fact, if you only have one document, but if you look at massive of other forms of evidence, that's what you build on. Second of all, or third of all, I don't know how many of all it is, you just heard my argument that deniers say Jews forged all the existing documents. So why didn't they forge this document? This one they had to know it would be the critical document. So in other words, that argument falls apart. Another argument deniers make is the Third Reich would have never left witnesses alive to testify. This was such a well-organized, efficient machine that they would never have let witnesses who had been in the camps alive to testify, this is what happened to me. It doesn't make any sense. So the very fact that there are people who claim even to have worked in the gas chambers, Sonderkommandos, people as the group of Jews who worked in the, mainly Jews who worked in the gas chambers were called, they worked there, they forced people in, they got undressed, they sorted the bodies, they cremated the bodies, and every 6 months they were killed. But some, in the last groups, a couple were left alive, A, because they didn't have time to kill them, B, one of them was a very famous graphic artist, French graphic artist, David Olaire. If you ever visit the Ghetto Fighters Museum in south of Haifa, I know there's some people from Haifa, they have a set of Olaire's drawings, and he draws what he saw, but he was very famous movie poster. If you know French movie posters, he was very well known for his drawings for movie posters. And apparently the SS officers in Birkenau would give him pictures of their family, and he would make drawings of them. So he was a valuable person to keep alive. But we have their testimony of what happened. But of course, deniers will say, well, Germans would never have allowed witnesses to stay alive. So the very fact that there are these witnesses proves the whole thing is a hoax. Because if you think about the Third Reich as such an organized, when it wanted to do something, it made sure it was accomplished and it wasn't going to leave hundreds of thousands of eyewitnesses. So when I give this argument to my students, I say to them, find the illogic in it. So I'm going to say it to you too. I'll give you a little hint to make it faster because we don't have unending amounts of time. What else did the Germans want to accomplish that they might not have accomplished? Win the war. So the supposition that, oh, they would never have allowed this to happen because they were so organized falls apart. So that too is one way of demolishing or finding the illogic in their argument. There was a very interesting moment at my trial. One of my historical witnesses was Christopher Browning, who I'm sure many of you know his many books on the Holocaust, but even if you're not a Holocaust historian, you probably know his Ordinary Men, how a police battalion was turned overnight into murderers. Christopher was testifying about the murder by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units in the East. And at one point, David Irving, who was acting as his own lawyer, not because he couldn't afford a lawyer, but because this was a great moment, the world press is there, the court is full, he's getting, historians, Richard Evans from Cambridge, Christopher Browning from North Carolina, Robert Jan van Pelt from Canada, all these, and others, Peter Longerich, leading scholars in the Holocaust, have to interact with him. Most of them would have nothing to do with him. So of course he wanted that experience, and that prestige. So they were talking about the Einsatzgruppen reports, the reports prepared by the mobile killing units on the Eastern Front and sent not just back to their headquarters and not just back to Berlin, but in certain cases, 70 different addresses would get copies of these reports with specific reports. How many Jews, men, women, children were killed, how many Roma, Sinti, Gypsies, if you will, were killed, how many partisans, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, the number of Jews killed is always, by a factor sometimes of 100, 200, 300, higher than any other group, if not higher than that. So Irving says to Browning, who's in the witness box, he says, but Professor Browning, couldn't these numbers have been bloated? Couldn't they have been exaggerated by the killers? And I thought I was going to fall under my chair under the table when Christopher says, yes, that's entirely possible. And I said, wait a minute, he's our witness. Why is he agreeing with Irving? And then he paused and he says, but That goes to show, if they were exaggerated, for which we have no evidence that they were, but if they were exaggerated, what does it show? That headquarters wanted large numbers. So, you know, if you're going to, yes, they could be exaggerated, but somebody there wanted large numbers of Jews killed. So again, you find the illogic in the argument and you turn it around. Another moment like that was when Robert Jan van Pelt, a historian and architectural historian who has studied Auschwitz in great, great detail, Irving showed him that one of the pieces of evidence he gives was he tracks the orders for Zyklon B, the gas that was used to kill Jews, with the number of Jews being deported and arriving at Auschwitz. And at the height of the killing, late 42, 43, the orders for Zyklon B spike way out of proportion to any of the other camps. Now, Zyklon B was a disinfectant. Used it to disinfect for clothes, for termites, for lice, whatever. But suddenly you have this spike. So you've got to explain why this spike in orders that doesn't correspond to orders from the other camps. And at the same time that the number of Jews arriving is spiking. So it's a discrepancy you've got to account for. And Irving, of course, is arguing, well, they're using it for mundane purposes, but but the other camps were also using it for mundane purposes. Even if you account for space for the size of the camp, there still is this ginormous increase in orders of Zyklon B. So you've got to ask, what else was going on in this camp that would have called for that a size of orders of gas? Ultimately, in my trial, and I'll talk about the strategy we use in just a moment, but what people like Browning and what Van Pelt and Evans and others, but specifically Browning and Van Pelt, who were talking about the killing process, was they relied on, and it's again, something deniers can't go up against except by saying it's all lies, a convergence of evidence, German documents, perpetrator and prisoner testimonies, architectural drawings, as well as I've shown you simple logic. And the only conclusion left is that there's a massive killing going on. We have orders, we have reports. By the way, many of these documents and the full transcripts of the trial are available on a website that I set up through my university, www.HDOT. It stands for Holocaust Denial on Trial, HDOT.org, O-R-G. And it has that funny address because it has its own portal out of fear that the deniers will bring down the whole university just going after my site. So if they're going to bring something down, let just be my site. HDOT.org. And you have there all these, you have you have Browning's witness reports submitted to the court. All the things I'm drawing, many of the things I'm drawing from here, Van Pelt's, Evans, et cetera, et cetera. Now, willful distortion and invention of evidence. When we were deciding on a trial strategy, and I say we, it was really my lawyers, I had terrific lawyers here in the UK, Anthony Julius and James Lipstadt. When they would decide on a strategy and they'd call me up and say, Deborah, we think we ought to do this, that, and the other. And with my vast experience as a defendant in a libel case, I didn't say, well, why don't we do it differently? I mean, you know, these are two men who have, at that point and ever since, have built their lives on fighting libel and distortions, et cetera. But we had certain strategy, choices of strategy. One choice of strategy would be to marshal all the evidence, all the documentation of the Holocaust. In other words, sometimes people say, I had to prove the Holocaust happened. Actually, that's wrong. We didn't prove that it happened. We could have marshaled all the evidence to show the judge, this is, and this is, and this is, and this is. But then David Irving would have marshaled his distorted evidence, his interpretation of the evidence, and it could have become a he said, she said kind of exchange. At the very least, it would have leveled the playing field, one side, the other side. And this is what happened, those of you who know a history of Holocaust denial, these kind of trials, in the Zundel trial in Canada in the late 1980s. There were two trials. The first trial, Raoul Hilberg was a witness. The second trial, Christopher Browning was a witness. Zundel was a denier, lived in Canada, a German expat, and he was tried under hate speech laws. The first trial, the judge did not take judicial notice of the Holocaust. That means he didn't say, okay, the Holocaust happened, let's take that as a starting point and we'll move from there. So the whole trial turned into a proving of the Holocaust. And it was a hung jury. The jury couldn't decide. In the second trial, it was handled much differently, and Zundel was convicted. But we didn't want that level. It wasn't a debate. I don't debate deniers. Really, their strategy emanated from a position I had taken long before I was sued by David Irving, that I don't debate deniers. I don't debate deniers because you can't debate liars. You can debate people with whom you have a diametrically opposed opinion. But to debate a liar, it's like nailing a blob of jelly to the wall. It can't be done because they just pick a different thing. They just make up as they go along. So instead, we decided and by the way, this is pretty much, as far as I've learned and come to understand, standard operating procedures for libel trials in the UK, where the burden of proof is on the defendant. The burden of proof in a libel trial is on the author, or in slander, the speaker. The person who created the words has the burden of proof to prove that her words are true. So that's one of the reasons, by the way, again, parenthetically, that some people said to me, including leading historians of the Holocaust, oh, just ignore it, just ignore this. It's a stupid thing that you're being sued for this. Go do your real work instead of fighting this. Well, the problem is that if I had ignored it, he would have won by default. And so when I said that to someone, oh, nobody will believe him anyway. But first of all, you don't want to take a chance when you're someone else. Oh, I was wrong. I'm sorry. When you're the person being sued, and B, there would be people who would have said, well, I still think something happened, but he won, so there must be something there, et cetera, et cetera. So instead, what we did is, instead of proving what happened, we set out to prove that what I said about Irving was true. And it is a distinction with a difference. In other words, when Irving said, this document proves that there were no gas chambers, or this document proves that whatever it might be, we went back, we followed his footnotes. Or Hitler said X, Y, and Z, he would give a footnote about a telex, or a notation in the diary of what Hitler said. We went back to the original source in every single case. And in every single case, we found some lie, some distortion, some invention. So in other words, we weren't proving what happened, but we were proving that what he said happened, he had no evidence, or the evidence he cited was a distortion of evidence. So at one point, there's a sort of dramatic moment where if you just read it, there are many dramatic moments, and many boring moments as well, but if you just read it, it sounds very strange. My barrister stands up, the person who argues in court, and he said, Irving had said at one point that only, and I put only in quotation marks, I think 64, 68,000, I remember the exact number, Jews died at Auschwitz. Not murdered, died at Auschwitz. And he bases that on a selection of the people who were registered into the camp. But if you went straight to the gas chambers, you were never registered into the camp. So my barrister stood up and said, Mr. Irving, I'm not interested in proving how many people were murdered at Auschwitz. I'm interested in proving to this court that when you say only 64, 68,000, you don't have the evidence to prove it. So instead of putting up arguments to counter his arguments, we pulled the ground out from under him. And at one point, in the beginning of the trial, the judge was giving him great leeway, which is generally what judges when a person is pro se, when a person is representing them themselves, what British judges will do. They will give the person who's chosen to defend themselves a great deal of leeway. But as time went on, and as we showed over and over again, that when he said, I have a document here that proves XYZ, and you looked at the document and it didn't prove XYZ, and it didn't even prove ABC, the judge began to say, Mr. Irving, the document doesn't say that. The document doesn't say that. So we pulled the ground out from under his arguments. And the reason I called my book originally, now it's called Denial because of the movie, but originally my book was called History on Trial. Not the Holocaust on trial, but history was on trial. How do you do history? How do historians reach opinions? When can we say, okay, that's within the margin of error? Not all historians agree on things. That's legitimate difference. And when can we say that's absurd? Evans looked Richard Evans in his book, Lying About Hitler, looks at that argument very closely. And as I said, Auschwitz and the killing process was examined by Robert Jan von Pelt and Christopher Browning on the document. What do we know? What documentary evidence do we have on the implementation of a policy to kill Jews in German-occupied Soviet territory? So for instance, just as an example, Browning was looking for the evidence. When Irving claims there were no mass shootings, the numbers are false, etc., what documentation do we have concerning the implementation of a policy to kill Jews in camps other than Auschwitz? What documentation do we have on the various killing processes, on the reports, etc., etc.? And again, if you go to the website I just mentioned, HDOT, you'll see it all there. Ultimately, the bottom line, when you looked at reports such as von Pelt's, Peter Longerich's, Christopher Browning, that denial is only possible by ignoring extensive and specific documentation. There's just this massive amount of documentation. And there, as I said in the beginning, deniers, there's no documentation, there's no material evidence, there are no witnesses, there's no narrative. All there is this constant attack on the evidence. So let me get to the other two legs and do it a little more quickly, because I think both will be pretty evident to you. Why had the deniers accomplished even the little bit that they have accomplished? And I think there are more people, as I said earlier, who don't know about the Holocaust than who don't believe it didn't happen. But we got an example last night in the show of a man who, Icky, who presents as if he's not a historian, but this rational discourse on, you break it down, of course, it makes no sense, again, as we saw last night. But the modus operandi adopted by deniers, it's a new form of neo-Nazism, and I don't know what neo, maybe we could just leave out the neo, and white supremacy. And it's where the two most closely come together. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. There's no physical trappings of Nazism, salutes, songs, banners, even the names they chose for themselves. What did they choose? Revisionists. Now, those of you who are historians know that revisionism is a legitimate approach to history. You revise accepted notions. I live in the South of the United States, and if you look at early histories of the American South, you wouldn't know there were any black people in the South. You wouldn't know there were any women in the South. They're histories of white Christian males. Today, if you were going to write a history of the region of the South and you didn't explore the experience of the slave and the experience of women, and not to equate that with slaves, but it would be ridiculous. Or revisionism, how big a threat really was the Soviet Union? Was it a place that was rotting from within and would have collapsed anyway, or was it really a superpower? Or I'll give you a very accepted form of revisionism, the term is used there. After 1919, or after 1920, 21, 22, later, as people began to study the Versailles Peace Treaty and the Paris Peace Accords from World War I, people thought they were quite good. Some people dissented already, but the majority opinion were these were forceful. And now, today, we recognize them as a contributing factor in allowing for the rise of Nazism. That's a form of revisionism. Dreyfus, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, France, accused of treason, a Jewish officer, one of the few, if only, Jewish officers at that rank. People assumed he was guilty. Revisionism now, everybody knows, acknowledges that he was framed. So what do deniers choose this name? We are revisionists, and you should not use the term Holocaust revisionists. Holocaust deniers is what they are. But they want to present themselves as revising mistakes in history. Their institute was the Institute for Historical Review. Their journal was the Journal for Historical Review. It was, and it remains, extremism in the guise of rational discourse. Make it look like rational discourse when it really is extremism. And Holocaust denial arguments, of course, are, as I've shown before, but even here, masters of inconsistency. What do they say? They say, they'll argue as you know, anti-Semites that they are, the murder of the Jews was entirely justified, but it never happened. Or it's sort of like a no-but argument. No, it didn't happen, but it should have happened. Because if you read how they depict the Jews in Europe and Jews in Germany, they're disgusting, but they were not killed. The other thing we hear about today that is often also seems to be rational discourse is softcore Holocaust denial. What I faced in court was hardcore Holocaust denial. And you know the terms softcore and hardcore from pornography, usually. That's where they're used. And I use that consciously because I see Holocaust denial as a pornographic form of history. Why do we hear so much about the Holocaust? Why do we only hear about the Jewish victims? Or as Robert Faurisson, a leading French denier who has since passed away, said to me when I interviewed him, in war, terrible things happen, lots of people die. That doesn't mean anybody deliberately tried to kill them. Or what we're seeing today in Poland with the Polish government. The Polish government trying to not deny what happened, but rewrite the role of some Poles in the genocide. There were Polish rescuers. The largest number of rescuers of Jews in Yad Vashem is Polish, people of Polish origin. But there were also, we know this from memoirs, we know this from reports, we know this from documents, there were many Poles who killed Jews before, during, and after. We just marked the anniversary of the pogrom in Kielce, which took place after the war, when Jews had come back, and Poles said, well, you're back, I'm living in your house, whatever it might have been. But that's a form of softcore denial. Or in relation to the state of Israel and your attitudes toward, you can think Israel's policies towards the Palestinians are completely wrong, strategically wrong, morally wrong, unethical. You can think they have no legitimate arguments behind them. However, you can't talk about a genocide. But you'll hear that, the genocide of the Palestinians, the worst crime since Nazism. The Palestinian birth rate is skyrocketing, which is of a great concern to Israelis who want to ensure a Jewish state, but that's for another conversation. But to invert, it's what some historians call an inversion. You take the victims and you apply to the victims the crimes of the perpetrators. So the final point I want to make, and with this I want to close, is why do I say that it is, and argued, as I've said a number of times, that this is a form of classic anti-Semitism? Again, you've heard this and you will hear it, and I think you've already heard it in presentations, but I'll repeat it and I apologize. You'll just feel smart, so I know what she said in it. The roots of anti-Semitism are to be found, I would argue, in the New Testament and the way in which the New Testament was interpreted and taught for millennia. You could argue that what's in the New Testament is not anti-Semitic. It's been written by Jews, it's been written by people who, children of Jews, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm talking about how it was taught, and again, Professor Patterson went through this for some of us yesterday, how it was taught, how it was interpreted. The story, the way the story has been interpreted, the way the story is told, the way the story appears to a certain extent, is that Jesus wanted to chase the money changers out of the temple. The high priest didn't want that to happen, and the priests didn't want that to happen because they had a vested interest in those money changers working in the temple. They went to the Romans and they said, kill Jesus because he's a troublemaker. And they didn't want to do it. For various political reasons, they didn't want to do it. But the Jews cried, crucify him, crucify him. They put pressure on the Romans, and the Romans relented. And in that story, and again, I'm emphasizing, and the way that story was used in the Middle Ages, for centuries through a very long period of the Middle Ages, you have the template for anti-Semitism. Money, intellect, smarts, nefarious smarts, malicious smarts, diabolical smarts, on how to get the Romans to follow your will, even though they don't want to do it, and power. Because think of it, they weren't just convincing the entity which had power over Jerusalem to go along with them, but you remember the maps, I don't know, again, not too many people here, we used to have maps you didn't put on a computer and just project it. You had these roll-down maps. Remember, once you rolled them down, you could never roll them up. I don't know, they stayed down for the rest of the school year. And during the summer, someone would roll them up, and the first day of class, they come down and they stay down. But if you looked at the map of the Roman Empire, it seemed that the whole world was under the control of the Roman Empire. And yet these small group of bedraggled Jews in Judea, not called Palestine at the time, not called Palestine for well over 100 years after that, are able to convince the Romans to do something against their will. So you have money, power, intellect, all used nefariously, all used without any consequences for the harm it's going to do to others, and a power to get things to move. It's the birth of the conspiracy theory. So why do I apply that to Holocaust deniers? Let's say you are in an airplane. Now, I have a philosophy, I don't talk to the person next to me in an airplane until we're about to land. You know, they say, fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to land. I turn, is this home for you? Are you visiting? What do you do? You know, I'm a researcher, as are many of you, and in 15 minutes you can get a lot of information, and if you have to taxi along, you even have 20 minutes to get this information. And if the person is utterly fascinating, you exchange contact information. But let's say you sat down on a plane that was going transatlantic, a long flight, in other words, and you sat down next to David Irving. And you said to him, what do? You want to be friendly, you want to be nice, big mistake. And he says, I work on the Holocaust, and you know very little about the Holocaust, but you say, oh, it was a terrible thing, it was a terrible thing. My kids have studied about it, I know a little. And David Irving would say, madam, you'll be very glad to know it didn't happen. As he said to a woman in the hall during my trial, who said, Mr. Irving, my mother died at Auschwitz. He said, madam, you'll be glad to know she died of typhus, and she was never killed. You know, it was a horrible moment. But in any case, and you for the next 8 hours, you listen as he explains to you all the reasons why it couldn't have happened, some of which I've demolished here. But he has many others in his toolkit. So the logical question you would ask at that point is, why? What's in it for the Jews to make up this story? What's the purpose? What's the result to go to all this effort, forge all those documents, get the Allies to follow them and convince the Allies to have these trials and all that? And David Irving would say, well, what did the Jews, quote unquote, get out of the Holocaust? And there are two answers that are given. One is correct and one is really incorrect, but Israel is one. The reason I say it's incorrect is that there would have been some political entity there without the Holocaust. The British were moving in that direction. It might have looked very different from what did, but it wasn't out of nothing. There was nothing there, and poof, because of the Holocaust, something was there. But what's the second thing they got out of the Holocaust? Reparations, money. There you have it. Power, they get a state, the power to get a state, the power to convince the Allies to go after the Germans to hold these trials, and money. You have an answer, and we heard this yesterday from one of the presenters, that when something is repeated often enough, it makes sense to you. When someone tells you something stereotypical in my country about an African American, about a gay person, and if the stereotype matches what we're used to hearing about that person, it makes sense. So if what they're telling you fits, if they said they did it because they wanted to wipe out all the other tennis players, or they were shiftless, they were lazy, they were effeminate, all stereotypes associated with other groups against whom there's tremendous prejudice, you would say that's crazy. But if you say secret, power, conspiracy, money, it makes sense to anybody raised. One time I would have said in Western culture, but I don't even need to delineate culture. So it makes sense. So what we're seeing here is something that is a form of anti-Semitism. It's not rooted in anti-Semitism. It's not emanates from anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism. And that's what we're seeing here, and that's how they have evolved. I'll be happy to take any questions now. Thank you very much. I'm not disappearing, I'm just getting water. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture. Well, I'm from Ukraine, that's why maybe I need to give it just a bit more context before I will ask my question. In Ukraine, as in any other nation or state, we have this complexity of national myths, national mythology, and one of these complexes myth of national ethnic heroes. In our cases, millions of Ukraine who died during the big hunger. And also we have now in Ukrainian society some case of Holocaust denial, or, as you mentioned,
Softcore.
Denial, or weak memorialization of Holocaust and so on. And some part of Ukrainian society think or have this anxiety that their recognition of Holocaust and active memorialization of Holocaust and all millions of Ukrainian Jews who was killed during the Holocaust could potentially lead, provoke the dismiss of Ukrainian heroes from this pantheon of national
That's right.
martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
So my question now is, what do you think about the impact of national ideology on denial of Holocaust?
You raise a very important and very legitimate point. I just gave an interview in the Times of Israel. I was over-caffeinated and underslept, so the filters were down, and I spoke the unfiltered truth as I see it, exactly about this issue. And in fact, it's problematic in Israel because Netanyahu has forged very close relations with the Polish government, with the Hungarian government, which is doing the same thing, the Lithuanian government, et cetera, and other countries in the former Soviet bloc. And what you have in many, if not most of these countries, exactly as you describe it, that many of the leaders pre-World War II leaders, and some of the people who made common cause with the Germans, in part because they were fighting the Soviets, and there was a fear of the Soviets, were also overt anti-Semites. And how do you say this national hero we have was also an overt anti-Semite? Again, to quote William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize winning American author from Mississippi, from Oxford, Mississippi, the past is not dead, it's not even past. It is very much part of the contemporary situation. Hungary, let me focus there on Hungary just for a moment. It's not exactly parallel, but there are enough parallels. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is intent on rewriting the Hungarian history of the Holocaust. Why? First of all, Hungarians were allies of the Germans until March of '44, when the Germans went in and took over, not because the Hungarians had refused to kill the Jews, which they had until then. They had persecuted them, put them in labor camps. Many had died, but they hadn't agreed to a systematic deportation. So in March of '44, you still had a Jewish community of about 800,000. But the Germans go in because they're afraid the Hungarians are going to switch sides and make peace with the Allies. So they go in, they take over. Admiral Horthy, who was the head of the government, agrees to be their puppet. And then a few days after, a week or so after they've gone in, Adolf Eichmann arrives with fewer than 300 SS officers. In the space, that's the end, towards the end of March, third week in March or so. Beginning in May through beginning of July, 7 weeks, they deport over 500,000 Hungarian Jews, of whom over 400,000, 420, 30,000, and you shouldn't be glib with numbers like that, but it's between 420 and 430,000, Hungarian Jews are murdered at Auschwitz. It's that killing that gives Auschwitz its dubious distinction of being the world's largest killing grounds, Birkenau. What Horthy would like to do is not say that those people weren't murdered, but that it was strictly a German program of which the Hungarian people were victims. Hungarian non-Jews were victims as well as Hungarian Jews. But you don't carry out something like that so rapidly without the assistance of Hungarian train system, Hungarian gendarmes, Hungarian police, plain old Hungarians on the street who are turning people in, etc., etc. But the Hungarians want to engage in exactly the kind of softcore denial you're talking about. Not to say it didn't happen, as the Poles are doing, but we were purely victims. And it becomes very problematic, especially in places like the Ukraine, because the people you're saying who did it are national heroes. And to some degree that's in Hungary too. They're transforming Horthy back into a national hero. So you have the monument in the center of Budapest, which shows, with the person holding the apple up, that we were all victims. The House of Terror, which shows Nazi crimes and Soviet crimes. Most of it is devoted to Soviet crimes. And when you're in the portion of the Soviet crimes, who are the local Soviet collaborators? They're whole Jews that they mention. So it's got a rewriting of history with a great overlay of anti-Semitism. And it's a battle that has to be fought, and I think spoken about constantly. And it's easy for me to do from the safety of the United States and others, but I know I just was in Poland 2 weeks ago, and I met with a lot of Polish historians, academics, museum people who are fighting this very, very desperately and very strongly. And I know in the Ukraine, it's the same thing. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. It's such a wonderful opportunity to listen to you.
Thank you.
Ask you questions. Mine is, how do you think the narrative and actions and interactions of the Holocaust denial have changed in the last decade, specifically related to the role of social media and how it's connected with the current practices?
Right. I think that on some level, my trial, not my trial alone, but partially my trial, put great damage to the outright deniers. Though, of course, last night in the show we got an example that may not be as true as we think. But what I think has happened is the softcore denial, whether on a national level, as we just heard from the previous questioner, or in lighthearted, kinds of ways, or Ken Livingstone, which is denial to say that the Zionists were in cahoots with the Nazis. It's simply not true. There was one agreement that from 33, I think August 33, which allowed Jews in Germany to get some of their goods out if there was, and with that money, agricultural material would be bought for Israel, for Palestine, Judea, Jewish Palestine, etc. But there was not, what he's saying is a complete fabrication, as the Panorama reporter or producer made clear. So I think we've seen a move towards softcore denial, because that goes over better. Hardcore denial, people say, oh, come on, we know that there were gas chambers or that. Social media has had a tremendous impact. No longer can you talk about lone wolves. You don't need an organization of deniers. They quote the same people. Again, as was demonstrated last night in the show, they quote the same people, they cite the same sources. The murderer in Pittsburgh and the murderer in San Diego County relied on the same blog posts, the same websites, the same symbols. So in general, the media, social media, which I love, and the internet, which I use constantly, but it provides another kind of weapon that is harder to fight. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. So in trying to understand the mind of the denier, I'm trying to figure out if we can call deniers liars if they're under conspiratorial thinking. Are they willfully lying, or have they contracted conspiratorial ideology? And if it is true that they are not lying, that they have simply installed flawed software, is it our duty to troubleshoot that software?
That's a great question. You wrote that all down while I was, I just write down little notes, which I can't even read, much less sound so articulate. It's a great question. And very often I would ask myself during the trial, sitting 10 weeks from where I'm sitting closer than that table to David Irving, does he really believe what he's saying? I mean, he's seen the documents, he knows how he's twisting them and turning them, and having lots of conversations about this with my lawyers, James Lipstadt and with Anthony Julius. And basically, Anthony said, oh, I don't care what he thinks, Anthony likes to be a sort of outlier. But James and I talked a lot about it, and we sort of came to the conclusion that he knows when he first looks at the document, he knows he's lying. He knows he's making it up. But then in this weird psychological process, he convinces himself that it's absolutely true. So I think you get that. I think that some of the people at the heart know they're lying because they're making up and they know they're twisting. Or this couldn't, but also what's possible is you put on, you see it through a prism, bends light, and you say, oh, this must mean that the Jews did this, that, or the other. Or this couldn't be the Jews. Because the prism, the facets on the prism through which their view of this incident is reflected are anti-Semitic. They haven't become anti-Semites because the Jews have made up the story. They believe that they're anti-Semites. So when they come to the information, they immediately say, oh, this can't be true. It's got to be a lie. So it's a sort of tautological explanation, but I think that's part of it. Yes, please.
So just to add to that, I have a question just to add to that. I mean, there is a well-established notion of confirmation bias.
That's right.
So people say, I'll believe it when I see it, but it turns out I see it when I believe it.
That's right. That's a good way of putting it.
But number two, in terms of what's happening in Eastern Europe, in terms of this idea of old national heroes, right? And as these nations are emerging from the former Soviet Union, there's at one level there's an understandable need to reestablish national heroes, pre-Soviet national heroes. I wonder if you feel that the United States struggle similarly as we go back and, for example, renaming colleges at Yale
you're much more sympathetic to America's process than I am. I just,
It's a struggle. but
yeah,
it's always-
I just finished a book that's not yet out. I'm reviewing it by Susan Neiman. Those of you from Berlin may know her. She's the head of the Albert Einstein Institute. Born in the South, taught in Tel Aviv University for a couple of years, and then has been and teaches at Yale and in Berlin. And it's got a very provocative title. It's called "What Can We Learn from the Germans?" And what she's done, she's not looking at comparative evil. She's not saying that it's concentration camp, slavery, the same as genocide, different from genocide. How is it different? How is it the same? She's looking at comparative redemption. How does each side remember and deal with what happened? And she does something that I think is very important. A lot of people will be upset by it. She argues, she's not the only one who argues this, that if you're talking about slavery, you're not in America, you're not talking about something that ended in 1865 or 4 or 5. But you're talking about, because there was a neo-form of slavery afterwards with sharecropping, with former slaves working the land, which they supposedly rented from the people who used to own them, bought goods from the stores run by the people who used to own them or their ancestors, paid interest on it right from the moment they bought the material or the goods they needed to raise the crops. By the time they turned in their crops, if they turned in 60 tons, they got credit for 40 tons, and then they had to pay these outlandish fees on what they had bought. So it was neo-slavery. You could never escape. You were always in debt, and if you tried to leave, you had faulted on your debts, and you could be arrested. And then, of course, Jim Crow laws, many of which are very similar to Nazi laws. I mean, if you go into in the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, and they have etched on the wall all the Jim Crow laws, all you have to do is change Germany, to Germany instead of American South. But I don't think America has dealt with it as well as it could. I think Germany has dealt with it much better. I don't want to whitewash Germany, especially with things going on now with Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, with a certain emergence of anti-Semitism, etc. But monuments. Even though there are German politicians who have criticized it, and many students of art and architecture and historians, myself included, who can't quite figure it out, in the heart of Berlin, there is a monument to 6 million Jews whom the Germans killed. Now, to some people, that monument has become, skateboard paradise. You can debate the quality, but still, there is a monument. In America, we have monuments to people who believed and fought for the right to own, sell, and bequeath human beings. And to say, Robert E. Lee he was a fine man and he was a great general. And people say he was a fine man, and he said to the soldiers, "Don't keep fighting, the war is over," etc. But he left the North to join the South to fight. Now, some will say he fought for states' rights. But states' rights to do what? States' rights to own human beings. So we haven't really dealt with it. And the conversation is beginning now in a different...
That's exactly my point. No, I want to clarify because I feel...
Okay, go ahead.
Misunderstood. I was talking about what's starting now, not what happened in the United States up till now. I was referring precisely to...
What's starting now? Okay, I agree with 100%.
That we are beginning...
What's beginning and what has changed now, and I think this book will contribute to it, and Ta-Nehisi Coates had a very important essay. Was it in the Atlantic or the New Yorker? The Atlantic, I believe, on reparations, making also that argument that it's not for slavery but it's for the financial crimes which left a whole major segment of the population of the United States in a financial disadvantage, not being able to pass on property to next generations, which is how you build wealth. I think we're beginning to deal with it, but I think that, okay, I'm sorry, and I apologize. But we're also seeing pushback.
Yes.
The majority leader of the Senate saying, "Oh, come on, slavery happened a long time ago. You don't expect us to be paying for that now," or something like that. I think it's going to get ugly because I think in the United States, white supremacists, white nationalists, call them what you want, I think supremacists, because that's more honest, who are also flaming anti-Semites. Remember, these white supremacists, what was the killer in Pittsburgh shouting as the SWAT team was bringing him down? Well, no, that was Charlottesville, but that's also part of it. You will not destroy the white race. In their eyes, in the eyes of the people in Charlottesville, in the eyes of the killer in San Diego, Jews are not white. And what did they mean in Charlottesville? What did they mean in Charlottesville when they said Jews will not replace us? That's replacement theory. Replacement theory, as many of you know, I'm sure, is the notion that there is a genocide of white Christians taking place. We see it with their words, swarm of immigrants, migrants, immigrants coming from Africa, Muslims into Christian Europe, changing the nature of Christian Europe and bringing it down. But the racist in them says, these black people, these brown people, these Muslim people, they're not smart enough to do this on their own. They're beneath us. They bring us down. Who is smart enough? Who is powerful enough? The Jew. The racist punches down. The anti-Semite in them punches up. The Jew is nefarious. The Jew is diabolical. The Jew is the Rothschild. The Jew is the Soros. Behind the scenes, you can't identify him. The puppet master. Some of you have seen I'm getting the hook here in 1 minute, but I'm going on anyway. It's my microphone for the next 30 seconds. And you will not replace me, you know? But it fits into that. So when they were chanting, Jews will not replace us, they look at, when did much of this begin in the United States or gain traction? With the Obama administration, looking at a black man in the highest office in the land, if not the world, a black family, even though they're a lot classier than a lot of other families who've lived in the White House, living in the White House, they couldn't stand that. And you got this emergence. And then you got pushback from Tea Party, from right wing, et cetera. So I think we're going to see it get uglier in the United States, even to the previous questioner, even as we see it being debated and dealt with.
But
so
at least, I'm saying, at least it's now being debated.
That's right. But don't ever,
Being changed,
absolutely.
monuments are coming down.
Right, you're absolutely right. Don't ever, if you're an American, let someone beguile you into thinking those are monuments to a glorious past, a relic of history. They were established 50 to 60 years after the end of slavery, when the sons of the Confederacy were trying to create this image and this notion of a noble lost cause. And the other ones in Atlanta, go to Stone Mountain, with the, Mount Rushmore of the South on the side of the mountain. And as you go up in the car, it has a little history. I think they've changed it. But when I first got there, I was gobsmacked, as the British would say, because they talk about how hard it was to build this monument. It's humongous. You can have a dinner party for 18 on the shoulder of one of I think on Robert E. Lee's shoulder or whatever. But they say they tried in 1912 and they ran out of money, and they tried again in 26, and then the Depression, they ran out. And the last line is, but in 1962 they completed it. Civil rights. So it's a monument to the past, but it's a lionizing of what recently was. Thank you very much.